In our last lesson, we saw that the nervous system helps the body respond to change by regulating other systems. For example, the hypothalamus in the brain regulates body temperature by sending messages to blood vessels in the circulatory system or muscles. Well, in order to understand how the nervous system can send these messages so quickly and efficiently, we have to take a look at the specialized cell that makes up our brain and our nerves and our spinal cord. And that cell is the neuron. This diagram shows the structure and soon the function of the neuron. As you can see, it doesn't look like a typical cell because it's got lots of branches. Well, that's because a neuron is kind of like a cell phone. It is designed to send and receive signals. And those signals can be in electrical form, here, or they could be in chemical form, here. Now, keep in mind that the electrical signals sometimes are referred to by other names. Sometimes you'll hear it called an impulse or an action potential. It really just means an electrical signal. So how does this work? Well, the neuron has small branches on one end known as dendrites, and dendrites usually receive the signal from another cell. Here, this is the part that looks most like a cell. This is the cell body. Here's where we would find organelles like the nucleus and the endoplasmic reticulum and the mitochondria and the Golgi body and ribosomes. Then we have one very long branch on the other end. This is known as the axon, and the axon's job is to send signals to the next cell. And the axon is wrapped in a material called myelin. Myelin is an insulating material, and that helps speed the electrical signal, just like telephone wires are wrapped with insulation. At the very end of the axon, we see synaptic terminals. Terminal means end. So this is where the signal is released to the next cell, but in chemical form. Now remember that the nervous system's function depends on its ability to send signals from one neuron to the next, maybe from neurons in this part of the brain to neurons in this part of the brain, or maybe from neurons in this part of the brain all the way to muscle cells at the tips of your toes. And the process of sending signals from one neuron to the next is a little more complicated than you might think, and here's why. Here we've got 3 neurons in a row. And as you can see, there's an electrical signal or impulse going through these neurons. And the signal travels so quickly, it seems like it's instantaneous. But really what's happening is this neuron is triggering a signal in this neuron, which is then triggering a signal in this neuron. And in general, the signals move from the axon to the dendrites. But there's a little bit of a problem here. If you notice, the neurons don't actually touch. There's a little gap between them. So the area where neurons almost touch is called a synapse. Here's a synapse, and here's a synapse. And the problem is that electrical signals cannot jump this gap. It just doesn't work. So another substance, a neurotransmitter, is needed. A neurotransmitter is a chemical that can cross the synapse. You can think of it as kind of a chemical boat that carries the electrical signal from one neuron to the next neuron. Let's look in detail at how that works. The structure of a synapse is something like this. Now keep in mind that we are zooming in on 2 different neurons connected, almost connected, at a synapse. So this is showing us the end of the axon of the neuron that's sending the signal, and it's showing us the start of the dendrite that's receiving the signal. The space between the 2 neurons is called the synaptic cleft. And then you'll note that there are neurotransmitters, these tiny little chemicals, in vesicles in the sending neuron. Also note that even though the neuron has a funny shape, like all cells, it's surrounded by a cell membrane, and that cell membrane has proteins in it, such as these receptor proteins. So now let's see how these parts work together to send a signal from one neuron to the next. Now you don't need to redraw this diagram, just take a note of the process that occurs. So first we have our electrical signal. It's traveled through the sending neuron and it's reached the end of the neuron. Once that signal arrives, that triggers the vesicles containing neurotransmitters to fuse with the membrane and release the neurotransmitters. You might recognize this process as exocytosis. Then those neurotransmitters diffuse across the cleft and they will bind to a receptor protein on the receiving neuron. Now that binding triggers a response in the receiving neuron. It might trigger a new electrical signal, or it could suppress an electrical signal. So this leads us to an important idea. There are actually many different neurotransmitters in your body, and we can put them into two main types. Some are excitatory, meaning they excite other neurons. So in this particular diagram, the neurotransmitter glutamate will excite an electrical signal in the next neuron. However, some neurotransmitters are inhibitory and they will suppress an electrical signal in other neurons. And this is important because in order for your body to maintain homeostasis, sometimes you need things to be stimulated to occur and sometimes you need to stop things that are going on in your body. So to close out, I want to show you a more realistic picture of a synapse. So as you can see from this picture, which you don't have to draw, a receiving neuron will often receive messages from multiple other neurons, and you can see lots and lots of synapses going on. These green ones are excitatory, and these red ones are inhibitory. So what a receiving neuron will do often depends on just how many excitatory signals it's getting versus how many inhibitory signals it's getting. And in class, we will take a look at some drugs that interfere with how these synapses work.